Okie dokie. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you. It's nice to do something a little bit different. I'll give you a brief introduction to me. So I work for Trouw Nutrition as their monogastric feed additive product manager, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically I'm responsible for looking after our feed additive portfolio. So we have a couple of brands that we have, and we have products that fall into kind of gut health, nutritional solutions, and kind of enterobacteria, salmonella type control products. I do a bit of everything. So I get out on farm and see people. I do technical support. I do marketing plans and things, pricing, bits and bobs of account management. I really love it because I get a real variety. I get to meet lots of different people. I get to do talks like this and at conferences internationally. Yeah, generally it's like a really nice varied role. So educationally, I did my BSc in zoo biology, and I did my PhD in poultry nutrition, specifically skeletal integrity of broilers. So basically from all the way through my undergraduate and after I graduated until I got my PhD, I did voluntary work at the Brackenhurst farm and their poultry research unit. I did also work full-time jobs as well in between finishing my BSc and starting my PhD, but they weren't particularly relevant ones, like I did as a science technician at a secondary school and that sort of thing. So all the way through my PhD, I taught on the animal nutrition modules at Brackenhurst. And then when I was towards the end of my PhD and after I finished, I ran the FDSC animal nutrition module and taught also on the BScs and the masters, and they did some kind of like food safety apprenticeship type things. So I taught a bit on those. And I also did a postdoctoral position in the nutritional analytical services department. So doing kind of all like feed additive trials and like nutritional analysis on stuff, basically. If you have any questions, like Tom said, feel free to interrupt at any point. I'd rather you interrupt me, ask a question, than forget about it if you leave it to the end. So I will tell you a bit about Trouw. So we belong to the Nutreco family of companies. Basically, Nutreco is a massive company. It's active all over the globe. There's two main divisions. So there's Trouw Nutrition, which deals with kind of companion animals and with agricultural species. And then there is Skretting, which is basically kind of like the fish side of things. So they look after all kind of the nutrition feed additives for aquaculture, and Trouw Nutrition looks after it for agriculture and in pet food and that sort of thing. So Trouw Nutrition GB, we have been in production now on our site in Ashbourne for 150 years, and we produce, last year we did over 100,000 tonnes of premix to go into animal feed. We cover poultry, ruminants, swine and pets. We have a really, really big on-site laboratory that we handle about 75,000 samples a year. And that's things like raw materials that people send in for their diets to get tested for things like mycotoxins or nutritional analysis or microbial contamination or yeast things. And they send in also water samples and that sort of thing. And we've got about 200 employees on site in the mill and in the offices. And most of our sales take place kind of on a business-to-business positioning. So we tend to sell premix into other businesses that produce compound feed, which means we're a little bit less well known than some other feed additive companies and things because we don't have a massive on-farm presence. Today, I'm going to talk to you about broilers, meat chickens, where they came from and where we think they might potentially be going in the future. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. So
I don't think your screen is moving on if you're...
Oh no, which slide are you on?
We're still on the beginning one.
Oh no!
I think it might have frozen on us.
Do you want me to try stop sharing and start sharing?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Let me see. Can we do it this way? Right. Are you moving along now?
There we go. That's better.
Yeah. So where do I get up to? I think I talked at you up to this point. There we go. So basically, our modern chickens are evolved from red jungle fowl. Basically, humans that were in the areas where these jungle fowl were realised that when they had loads of food, they had loads of babies. So they were really flexible and adaptable species, and that made them really suited to domestication. And also, it's those kind of original genetics that help them cope with all the intensive production that they are subject to today. Also, you've got some grey jungle fowl in there. If you're looking towards kind of Latin America, they have a lot more yellow-skinned birds, and those ones are descended also from grey jungle fowl. So they were domesticated eons ago. The early Greeks used them for entertainment with fighting, sacrificial rites. They were a symbol of fertility, and obviously people used them as alarm clocks and things. Pretty quickly, people realised you could get an awful lot of eggs out of these birds if you kept them in the right conditions. And then the Romans had a similar thing at a similar time, and they were throughout most of Europe by 200 BP. Breeding initially was just small backyard breeders, your old school chicken fanciers, dealing with heritage strains and all the purebred type things. They used them mostly for eggs, and then when they were finished producing eggs, they would eat them. So they started with all the pedigree breeding, really seriously began about 1916. And then most of the ones we have today come from a cross of those two birds up there. So you have a double-breasted Cornish and a Plymouth Rocks. The meat breed started being introduced kind of in the 1930s, and it became dominant after the chain of events I will discuss with you in a second in the 1960s. But the more they kind of interbred these heritage strains, the more issues they had with low fertility, slower growth, and disease susceptibility. So before World War I, poultry breeding was more of a cottage industry. Most people would have had a few chickens in the back garden. They very much just used them for eggs, and particularly during the wars when there was a lot of rationing, it was much more sensible to have eggs first, because that was a sustainable form of protein. You could keep getting that protein source until the birds were spent, then you could eat them. And then after all the servicemen came home, obviously they had to find jobs for them all, because they'd all been out of work for years fighting in the war. So the government put a lot of training and funding into teaching people to farm, and that's when you started to get the first kind of chicken farms. And those pictures below are some of the first kind of layer farms that would have been around back in kind of like 1920 sort of times. And World War II, even after then, it was still mostly an egg industry, and then meat birds were kind of like a byproduct. They would raise them to about 16 weeks, and then anything else that was a male went and got sent for eating, and then they kept the hens on for as long as possible. But there wasn't as such a dedicated meat breed. They were all one and the same. So after rationing came to an end and people have been not having very much chance to have meat very much, kind of people started wanting to indulge themselves and eat things more often when it was available. So a research director for A&P Foods over in the States told a poultry meeting in Canada in 1944 that it would be a really good idea if somebody could breed and develop a sumptuous chicken with a breast like a turkey's. So they're looking here specifically, they want that meat yield, and they want a bird that's good for roasting and good for eating specifically, rather than for producing its eggs. So by the next summer, they had set up the Chicken of Tomorrow contest, organised by the United States Department of Agriculture, and they had the backing of basically every single poultry and egg organisation in the country. So this thing was massive. It had 55 national organisers. They borrowed scientists and bureaucrats from government agencies, agricultural colleges got involved, hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and it was taking place across 44 out of 48 states. It was basically countrywide. They had the state contests in 46, regional judging in 47, and then they had the final national competition in 1948. So the winner of this was Charles Van Tress. Second place went to Henry Saglio, and they redid the whole thing in 1951, and Van Tress won again. So Henry Saglio, the runner-up, his family company was Arbor Acres, and they are still in production today under the Aviogen group of companies. And Charles Van Tress started Van Tress Cobb, which is still one of the two main broiler companies globally. So you have Cobb and you have Ross. And the guy that first won that original Chicken of Tomorrow contest, it's still his company that's still kind of at the forefront of broiler production nowadays. So when did these birds make it over to the UK? They were really reticent to bring them over because there was concerns about diseases, particularly the Newcastle disease, coming over. But eventually a Scottish breeder managed to get a special license to bring grandparent stock over in 1956. So this guy set up Chunky Chicks, which later became Ross Breeders, so the other of the two big broiler companies that you see today. And in 1978, Chunky Chicks officially became Ross. They are also now owned by Aviagen, so Cobb is still independent, but Aviagen and Arbor Acres, they're both, Ross and Arbor Acres rather, they're both Aviagen brands now. So this original bird that came over reached 2 kilograms in about 63 days with a FCR or feed conversion ratio of 2.5. In 2014, broilers were reaching 2 kilograms in 35 days with a feed conversion ratio of 1.6 to 1.7. So we have come quite a long way in that time. The current Ross standard breed for 2020 does 2 kilograms in 33 days or less with an FCR of 1.4 to 1.45. So they are still making improvements to those production parameters. So basically what we had in kind of 1956, 1957 was a bird that hatched at 34 grams, hit about 300 grams at 28 days, and then by 56 days was looking at just under a kilogram with an FCR of 2.5. What we have now is a bird that hatches about 43 grams. At 28 days, it's doing 1.5 kilograms, and at 56 days, it's doing over 4 kilograms. Now, what you can see here is quite interesting because when you've got the kind of 2005 numbers there, so it's gone from hatch to 34 to 44, there's a big jump there. From 300 to 1,300, there's a big jump there. And from 900 to 4,000, there's obviously a big jump there. But between the last two sets of numbers, so between 2005 to 2020, there's not actually a lot of difference in the hatch weight and the 56-day weight. There's only like 1 gram difference there. But what is interesting is where you see the 28 days weights, there's a 200 gram difference. So what they've done there is they haven't actually improved the hatch weight or the finishing weight of the birds, but they've improved the speed of growth. So you can see the birds are hitting a much higher weight now at 28 days than they would have done in 2005. So when they are breeding, when the genetics companies that own the kind of great-grandparent stock and breeding stock for these birds, what are they looking at when they're breeding them? So for consumers, all they're going to be particularly bothered about is what it tastes like and how much it costs them. There are a lot more people nowadays that are concerned about welfare, but historically that hasn't always been a big concern. When you're looking at what your farmers and your producers want, they're looking at efficiency of the birds. So they want to feed them as little as possible and, you know, keep them on the farm as short as possible time to make sure that they can maximize their profits. They want practical birds, so they want birds that are hardy and can, you know, they're not going to get ill all the time and they're going to be healthy. They're looking for flock uniformity, so they want their flocks all growing at the same speed, because that means you can get them all in on the same day, you can send them all out on the same day, and it makes organizing the whole process a lot more straightforward. So they want them to be profitable, so that means minimum labor inputs, minimum food inputs, minimum kind of management inputs, in terms of they don't want to be spending money medicating them, so they want them to be healthy. And then they're also now much more concerned about consumer perception. So they want birds to be healthy and to, you know, because you see all these horrific things that PETA put out where they go and break into broiler houses and they look at all the horrible state the birds are in. And people are much more aware now of some of the practices that would have been involved and still are in some countries, not in the UK. In the UK, we have the highest welfare standards pretty much globally. But in a lot of countries, especially where they're developing still, you know, welfare hasn't quite hit that peak yet where it's a big concern. They're more concerned about protein availability. But yeah, welfare and consumer perception is becoming much more important to breeders when they're selecting for traits. So this selective breeding has resulted in this. So this picture is taken from a study that was done at an American university, and what they had was they had 3 separate flocks of birds. The first flock was from the original stock that came over in 1956, and they did not selectively breed them at all from 1957 onwards. So that is what the original broiler that came over from America would have looked like. Then the middle picture is a flock there. They did not do any selective breeding from 1978. So that is what you would have had as a standard broiler in 1978. And then the last picture is a standard broiler from 2005. And this is the size they will be at 56 days. So you can see there is an enormous difference in that original meat bird that came over from the chicken of tomorrow and what we're dealing with in broiler sheds all over the country today. So we've got a 400% increase in broiler growth rates, 80% increase in breast meat, and a 50% decrease in feed conversion ratios. So this bird is completely different to the kind of historic bird we would have seen 60 years ago. These are cross sections through some of those carcasses from those flocks that they had preserved, and it demonstrates really nicely what actually an 80% increase in breast meat yield looks like on that chicken. So yes, the carcasses overall are bigger, but you can see that the amount of meat on those birds is massively different. So these are the birds that the farmers are dealing with. These are the ones that are economical to rear because the amount of meat that they put on in that short time is just phenomenal. It's like it boggles your mind. So from the cottage industries that we had before the wars, what we have now globally as a poultry industry is sustained growth of poultry meat. It's really appealing as a meat because there's no cultural or religious restrictions really involved in poultry meat. There's no like, you know, pork and beef, that sort of thing. People don't eat them for religious reasons, or you know, with things like lamb, a lot of people don't like the taste of it. Poultry is pretty much universally accepted. Most people will eat a chicken in one form or another, whether it's in nugget form or French dinner form or KFC form or whatever. Most people like chicken. So we've finally overtaken pigs as the most popular meat. And this is a global thing. Globally, the demand for poultry meat, because it's also quite cheap as a protein source, is increasing. In the UK, in 2014, the poultry industry contributed 3.6 billion to the economy. So you can see on the graph, that is the kind of comparative numbers of, or like the economic contribution of the various animals. Poultry obviously massively outstrips in economic importance beef, lamb and pork. And of that, you've got 91% of all poultry sales is chicken, broiler chicken in one form or another, or eggs. So in the UK, we slaughter about 1 billion broilers a year. I think it was 900 and something thousand million or whatever, not far off a billion. So that's an awful lot of chickens. So if we look a bit more at the actual poultry industry itself, what we've got is the majority in the dark green there is broilers, so meat birds. Then the light green is your laying hens. Pheasants and partridges actually make up quite a large proportion in the UK because it's still quite a big game sector. And then we've got turkeys, ducks and geese there in the yellow and blue. So every poultry farm or every poultry producer in the country with over 50 birds has to register on the poultry register, and everyone with under 50 birds is encouraged to register. But obviously, if you've got under 50 birds, you're not talking about a sizable flock, and probably not anything that's, you know, going to need keeping an eye on, nothing that's going to be intensively farmed there. So within the poultry industry, we have the broiler industry. So the 2 largest international breeding companies supply over 90% of the broiler stock in the UK. So 90% of the chicken you buy in the supermarket to eat will come from Cobb or Ross stock. Only one of them has pedigree stock in the UK, I believe that's Ross. And they keep the numbers that they have very confidential because there's massive competition between these 2 companies. But it's estimated there's hundreds and thousands of parent flock and breeding flock, broiler breeder flocks on the ground at any one time to supply the demand. So it's a big industry. So obviously, as they've bred these birds for this amazing production parameters, for this amazing meat yield, for this like amazing feed efficiency, they've also, by the law of unintended consequences, come across some problems. So these are things that when they were breeding initially, they could never have predicted that this would happen, but it is something that we've started to see pop up in the industry. So there's a huge amount of research now going into ways that we can kind of avoid these. So you see things like white striping. It's not a food safety or a welfare issue. It's just extra fat deposition in the muscle. So it doesn't look very appealing, but it shouldn't affect the flavour and it shouldn't affect the safety of the meat. Then there's woody breast. That's another relatively common one. Nobody knows exactly what causes it, but basically that's when the breast tissue is so stiff and firm that it's very difficult to cut, and even when it's cooked, it won't tenderize. And the leading kind of theory for what this is caused by at the moment is a reduced capillary blood supply. So because the animals are growing so quickly, they don't properly vascularize every area of the breast tissue. So some of it doesn't quite, the collagen lay down and collagen development is not slightly abnormal. Again, it's not dangerous to eat. You could view it as a welfare issue because obviously if the birds are growing so quickly, they're not completely vascularizing tissue. That could be a welfare problem, but it's not seen alongside any disease issues. So they're kind of on the fence about that. And then you see things like breast and hock burns. So in the bottom one, that's basically a form of contact dermatitis. And because these birds are so big and heavy, they don't like standing up very much, which means they spend quite a lot of time when they get older resting on the litter. And this can irritate them because obviously there's bound to be some presence. You can't muck chickens out every day. You've got a massive broiler shed. So they can get some irritation and contact dermatitis either on the breasts or on the hocks on the back of their legs. So skeletal issues. Basically, they've bred the birds for this brilliant muscle gain. What they didn't anticipate was that actually they hadn't at the same time selected for an increase in skeletal growth. So the birds have to partition the nutrients they eat. So they can take in a certain amount, a fixed amount of calories, a fixed amount of nutrients. They have to choose, their bodies choose where they're going to send those nutrients. And what we've done is bred birds that prioritize using these nutrients to grow muscle, often to the detriment of growing the skeletal system. So by no means is it every flock that has problems. By no means is it rife and common and every bird is suffering or in pain. But what we do see now is things like valgus and varus deformities, so things like bow-leggedness or knock knees, torsional deformities where the legs are a bit twisted, rickets, tibial dyschondroplasia, that's that middle picture. And that's basically where the bones are trying to grow so quickly that when you see across the top, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but there's like a little bar along the top where the red bit joins the white bit on that first bone that's gradually getting bigger. And that little bar is the growth plate. And that's where all the new bone cells are formed. And what basically happens is it's trying so hard to grow so much that it kind of just loses all the structural integrity of the cells it's producing. And then they get issues with things like tendon rupture from the excessive weight on legs. The bottom picture is an X-ray of a modern bone versus a historic chicken breed bone. So you can see the bones grow with extra curvature now due to them growing with the extra weight on them.
Sophie, just there, someone's just popped a question in, saying, when is nutritional focus on skeletal health most important in the bird's life cycle?
Oh, that's a good question. Basically, as young as possible. So they start developing the templates for their bones. So the bones start as like a collagen template, and then after they hatch, they start to mineralize that template and it starts to grow. So basically, as soon as those birds hit the ground and come out the eggs, you want to be getting the most optimum. I've got some slides on nutrition for skeletal growth in a minute, but you really need to start as soon as possible because from the second they hatch, they just grow like crazy. And you need to be getting that optimum nutrition in there so they have all the tools they possibly can have to lay down those building blocks for their bones, basically, because they've got that skeleton. They can't They can't like take it apart and rebuild it later in life. They're stuck with it. So why do we see these skeletal issues? The basic crux of the matter is faster growth basically means you've got greater energy demands. Things are trying to happen at a faster pace. They're trying to use potentially more nutrients and more energy than they actually have, and that just leaves more room for errors. And skeletal issues can obviously have impacts on welfare, on mortality and morbidity on the farm. So, you might have to cull more birds. It can cause losses of performance, because once a bird enters that stress response, if it's in discomfort or if it's got an illness, obviously then it's using energy to solve that problem rather than to grow. And also, when birds have issues with their legs, when they go through processing, a lot of them don't fit the machines or they are downgraded. So there's economic losses to take into account for producers as well. And most producers do recognise that healthy birds grow better and cause them less losses. So most producers that we deal with certainly are very, very keen on trying to improve the overall health of their flocks. People really are starting to, it's quite nice, because when I started doing poultry stuff in like 2007, there wasn't such a massive recognition of the importance of just overall well-being. And nowadays you really see that so many farmers are very, very awake to the fact that they want the best for their animals, because that gives them the best return on their investment. So skeletal development, this is what I was saying earlier, it starts really young and it's really hierarchical. So you have your collagen molecules being produced, they're arranged into the fibrils, they're then arranged into these matrices. And then when they're all arranged into matrices, there's little gaps left where basically the minerals can then be inserted. So if you don't have those collagen molecules correctly formed, and you don't have those collagen molecules being laid down in the most structurally sound manner, then those minerals that later on can't possibly mineralize in the most structurally sound way. So if you have everything, it's like trying to build a wall. If you build a wall and you don't overlap your bricks properly, and your mortar isn't correctly kind of created with the right ratios of sharp sand to cement or whatever, then that wall is not going to be very strong. If you stack them up all higgledy-piggledy, don't put mortar in half of them, you could probably push it over. And with bones, it's a similar thing. Like, you have to have the foundations in there correctly. And these foundations are being laid even in the egg. So even broiler breeder nutrition for skeletal health is important. So there we go. We have all these cells involved. The three main cells are osteoblasts, and they lay down new tissue and mineralize it. Then we have osteoclasts. So when there's a damaged bit of bone or an old bit of bone, then osteoclasts break that down and allow the osteoblasts to replace it with fresh bone. So your whole skeleton is constantly being updated and altered your whole life, depending on what sort of activity you do. So we have osteocytes as well, and they sit in little holes within the bone, and they have all these little processes that come out with gap junctions between them, so they can communicate. And what they do is, when they detect that the bone they're sitting in is under some kind of strain or stress, so if you were, for example, lifting weights or something, those cells in your bones are communicating and connecting with each other and sending messages to the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts to come and strengthen the bone in those areas. But obviously, when you have very young animals, they, and especially if they're very sedentary, so they're not moving around a lot because they're so chunky. So their kind of self-regulatory bone adjusting mechanisms aren't working as optimally as they possibly could. If you had chickens that were outside pecking around, moving all the time, those osteocytes would constantly be sending signals to the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts to come in and reinforce that bone and make sure it was strengthened where it needed it. But if you've got birds that are, basically what we have now is a load of birds with skeletons of toddlers wearing massive sumo suits, so they're just nothing's quite working optimally as it should be. So rapid collagen synthesis and mineralization, you get abnormal bone structure and function. Hydroxyapatite, which is the mineral composition of bones, if that's not laid down in an organized way, you get weaknesses. you often don't see the problems that are caused from this appear until later life. So when the birds are younger and they still are relatively light in weight, you don't see much of these problems. But as soon as they get to a certain point, obviously when they are hitting the point where they are carrying dramatically more muscle meat than their skeleton is designed to hold, that's when you kind of start to see the problems emerge. But by that point, it's already too late because the bones have already been built. So you need to address it as early as possible. And there really is no cure. If you've got a suboptimal skeleton, that's the skeleton you've got. You know, you have to focus on prevention rather than cure. So how do we feed for optimal skeletal health? So calcium and phosphorus, that's a hydroxyapatite molecule down there. As you can see, it is full of phosphorus and calcium. So all the red bits and the green bits are your calcium and your phosphorus. If they haven't got enough calcium and phosphorus, they cannot mineralize their bones. And you need to be precise, because there's a lot of research now to say that if you get your calcium to phosphorus ratios wrong, if you over supplement with them, it can actually have a detrimental effect, because if there's too much of one and not enough of another, then the hydroxyapatite will also be formed incorrectly. So it's really important to go into like precision nutrition and feed at an optimal ratio and not overfeed what you have. Vitamin D, so that helps with the uptake of calcium and phosphorus out of the diet. It helps with maintaining serum levels of calcium and phosphorus, so there's always these nutrients circulating for the tissue that needs it. Also very important for nerve signaling, so you've got your osteo sites in between the bone. They need this vitamin D to be present to signal for the bone kind of strengthening and stuff properly. And it's also used, it's to do with signaling for mineralization as well. Then there's a number of other nutrients, so zinc, so chondrocytes, which is the cells that kind of will differentiate into new bone cells in the growth plates. The zinc is very important for that process. So in that picture there, what you've got at the bottom is the kind of bone being formed, but what you've got right at the top of that long oblong is that's kind of like stem cell type things, but within the bone. And what they do is gradually differentiate and organize themselves as they go down. And they can't properly do that unless there's zinc present in the diet at the correct levels. So copper is very important for collagen cross-linking. So that initial collagen matrix that the mineral is then put onto, you need copper for that to be formed properly. Selenium is to do with chondrocyte maturation. So where you've got them starting at the top and then going down, you've got, you need selenium also for that process to happen optimally. And also selenium is really important for thyroid function. So the release of your actual growth hormones and that sort of thing from the thyroid, you need to have selenium for that as well, and to help with cartilage growth. I keep seeing things popping up at the top. Is that people wanting to ask me things? Or?
Yeah, someone's just popped in saying, do you think it's ethical to feed an animal to the point where its skeletal structure cannot support it?
Oh, that's such a good question. And the answer is technically no. If people had known what they know now, that this would all be a result of breeding for the really high growth rates and things, then they inevitably would have done it differently. But unfortunately, when they were doing all this breeding, you don't know it's going to happen until after it's happened. So now we're in a situation where this is what we have to deal with, and we kind of have to do the best we can to mitigate it. So there are strategies you can take nutritionally to help the birds as much as possible. There's various different feed additives and things you can give to them to kind of help with minimizing any issues they have. And also I'm going to go on in a second and we'll look at some other options for what we can do going forwards to try and have no more breeding of accidental problems into chickens.
Someone's just added in, do you think breeding will cause another similar big issue in the future?
Oh, I would imagine so at some point. It's inevitable, isn't it? There's always an unintended consequence. I mean, to be fair, nowadays, compared to when back in the 50s and 60s, when they were really intensively breeding, You know, they didn't have all the access to things we have now. We have amazing things. We've mapped the entire chicken genome. We have like the breeding programs are mind-blowing. You know, they have individual gene markers. They know exactly what genes each generation have. And as soon as they see an animal that expresses a gene that's not good, it's taken out of the breeding program. You know, even if a bird grows 500 times faster than every other bird, if it also displays leg weakness, it's taken out the program. You know, they've just got now this kind of zero tolerance approach to all these health issues. So it might mean in the future we see slightly smaller chickens, but we will definitely see healthier chickens going forwards, I think. I'd like to think so anyway, unless something else, you know, you can't ever predict it. We might accidentally, you know, breed a chicken that has the wrong kind of feathers and then they will freeze to death or something. But I think, you know, you can't rule it out as a possibility, but with the amount of control and the amount, especially of technology that's involved in the breeding now, it makes it kind of a lot more unlikely that it will happen. But I said there'll definitely be some other kind of controversy. There's always another controversy to happen, and we'll just have to do the best we can to deal with that when we get there and try and minimize any potential issues for the animals as they arise, I suppose, like we do now. So potential solutions to these crazy fast growing birds. So they are standard broiler houses up there, those pictures. They are not all that nice and light and airy. Well, they probably actually are when the birds are that little, but yeah, they don't stay that nice. It's quite an intensive process. You can see there's an awful lot of chickens in there. What can we do? We have our standard barn reared broilers, so that's more what it looks like in the broiler house when the birds get bigger. They are generally quite intensively farmed. They have quite high stocking density. They generally don't have any access to outdoors, and that might sound a little harsh, but what we've done is breed birds that really aren't geared up for outdoor life. They don't have very good tolerance to quick changes in temperature. They don't have very much tolerance to bad weather. They don't have very much tolerance to pathogens. So what we have is intensively farmed birds that grow as fast as possible with as little input as possible, because inevitably it's a supply and demand situation, and people want cheap meat. People want to be able to go to Iceland and buy 20 chicken breasts for £5, you know, and people don't stop and think. I mean, now people are a lot more conscious of what they buy, but also if you can afford to be that conscious about what you're buying, that's quite a privileged position to be in, because a lot of people, you know, they can't afford to feed their children a good source of protein. They need accessibility to cheap meat like chicken, because otherwise, you know, you're going to have a generation of malnourished kids living in poverty, especially with all this increased reliance on food banks, and especially now with COVID as well, with all the issues with people being out of work and that sort of thing. So it's important that we maintain that, you know, nobody's going to want to go and buy a roast chicken for 15 quid. That's just not realistic. So we can say in an ideal world, we'd switch to all these wonderful management practices, but we'd all be out of business and all the farms would shut because no one would buy them. There's just not the demand for that kind of supply. So yeah, what could we do? What are possible options to try and turn the situation around? So we could try free range or organic rearing. Now, certainly that picture looks a lot more idyllic. It looks a lot happier and nicer. So as with laying birds, you've got similar rules. So, you know, like if you've got caged layers, then they don't have any outdoor access. That's like the kind of barn reared broiler equivalent. Then you have set amount of time they have to have access to the outdoors through pop holes in the barns. And if you're organic, they have to be ranged on organic land, and they have to be fed organic food and that sort of thing. So the similar rules that you would have for layers also apply to broilers. When you have free range and organic birds, they have lower stocking densities. So that's, you know, that's a positive thing. They use a slightly slower growing bird, so it does take longer for them to grow to a slaughter weight, and they do have a higher FCR, so that does mean they are more expensive. And then unfortunately also you have issues with external factors, so you can always get predators getting onto land. No matter how well you think you fox-proofed your ranging land, there will always be a fox that can get on, or you have things like hawks that come from above. You cannot possibly net over an entire farm. That would be madness. Bad weather, they don't do very well in bad weather, even the ones that are slower growing. And then you have things like avian influenza. So at the minute, we've got a spate of it going around the country. There's restrictions where all the free range birds are going to have to come inside on the 14th, so in a few days' time, for just until the outbreak clears off. And often what you see is farms that are geared up towards outdoor production like this don't always have the best indoor facilities, because the indoor is basically designed to house the birds at night when they would be roosting and sleeping. So it's not always the best environment for them to be in all day when they're trying to move around and things. So, it's not geared up for them to be in 24/7. So yeah, basically poultry and free range is very expensive to produce, very difficult to produce. It requires quite a lot of investment to set up a free range or organic setup, and there's just not the demand for meat. It's like in America, they had a big thing where they went to this, rather than going on the we'll just try and reduce antibiotics, they did a no antibiotics ever campaign, and they produced loads of farmers, invested millions in rearing all these birds to have never had any antibiotics, never had any ionophores or any medication. And then most of the farmers went out of business because there was no demand for the meat. So they ended up spending all this money on these brilliant, like, no antibiotic birds, but then no one wanted to buy them. So they had to sell them all off at a normal price, and took a massive financial hit. And a similar thing would happen in the UK if everybody went free range and organic. You would just have loads of people going out of business because they'd spent all this money rearing these birds, and then no one was willing to pay enough for them for the farm to make a living, kind of thing. So this is a quick infographic about differences between free range and organic meat and normal. So obviously indoor reared birds grow much faster at 35 to 40. Then you've got free range at 56 and organic at 81. Access to open air runs, 0 obviously for indoor reared in orange, and then free range and organic have to have access for 50 and 33%. In the middle, yeah, you've got stocking density. So you can put 38 kilograms per meter squared of bird on indoor barns. In free range and organic in the barns, you can only put 27.5 kilograms or 21 kilograms inside. And there you've got, if you've got an avian influenza outbreak or something, and you have to bring the birds in, they put those stickers on. I don't know if you saw them last time they did it, where they put on free range eggs, currently not free range for their own safety. But then you can see in that big square in the corner, you've got over 95% of our poultry meat is indoor reared, because that is where the demand is. People want it to be cheap. And then you've got 3.5% free range and less than 1% organic. Organic feed is a nightmare because such strict restrictions on what feed ingredients you can use. It's really difficult. Like if you find you suddenly can't get one of your normal raw materials, to be able to replace it can be an absolute nightmare. And if you can't replace it, that whole flock then has to be written off as not organic. So then all the extra money you've spent on all the organic feed they've had prior to that is pretty much wasted.
Sophie, can you see any sort of change in any of those percentages of the total meat production? People are always saying that they care more about it.
Yeah.
But is that just saying it rather than actually doing that at the supermarket?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where people care and they want to make the change, but if you're a bit skint and it comes down to it and you want to get a roast chicken for your dinner, you're going to pick the cheapest roast chicken if you're, if it's the end of the month and you're a bit skint. So people are now more aware, and those numbers will increase, and they do steadily increase, but it's kind of like everyone wants to make a difference. How many people do you know that have watched one of those horrible animal welfare videos, then pledged to be vegan, and then they've done it for like a couple of months with the absolute best of intentions, but then it's just so difficult or so expensive to kind of maintain that they'll then kind of tone it down a bit and whatever. If people are looking at going organic, for example, they'll often focus on the veg and the fruit, because that's a lot less expensive to eat organic fruit and veg. And yeah, unfortunately, there is such a big price difference between organic or free range meat and not, that it's often difficult for people, even with the best of intentions, to make the change. But yeah, I certainly don't think anyone's running out to supermarkets going, I'm going to find the chicken that's had the absolute worst welfare I can possibly find, and I'm going to buy that one. You know, I think everybody wants to do the best they can, but the extent to which people can actually do that is, like, you know, it varies massively. So if it's not really economically feasible for all our farms to suddenly become free range or organic, why don't we use a slower growing strain of bird? So obviously the majority of the problems that we've talked about have been caused by these explosive growth rates. So it stands to reason that if we just slowed the growth rate down a bit, we reduce some of the problems. So average broiler grows about 62 grams a day and reaches its market weight in about 35 days. Slow growing strains grow about 50 grams a day or less, and it takes them an additional 2 weeks to reach market weight. So is this a good thing? Well, yes and no. So slower growing birds do demonstrate improved health and welfare with less of the issues that we've spoken about earlier. However, chickens require resources. Obviously, they have to eat, they take up land, they have to drink, and 2 extra weeks on a farm translates to an enormous amount of extra resources. So I've got some interesting facts for you here. So when they grow slower, they're on the farm longer. That means that there is less flocks of birds going through a farm every year, so each farm can produce less birds, and that any type of agriculture impacts the environment. Even if you're growing strawberries, there's still going to be an environmental impact. The longer it takes it to grow, the more resources it will use while it's growing. And if even only a third of broiler chicken producers switch to slower growing breeds, we would need nearly 1.5 billion more birds on the ground every year to produce the same amount of meat. And you think, when our population is exploding, you know, and we're saying we're going to have to feed billions of more people over the next 10, 20 years, is this a, you know, can you feasibly convert to slower growing strains? Possibly not, if it involves 1.5 billion more birds on the ground. So obviously they're alive 2 extra weeks, they have to eat for those 2 extra weeks. To feed all the extra birds for 2 more weeks, it would be 670,000 additional tractor trailers of feed on the road every year, using millions of gallons of fuel. So also, that's not great for the environment. You know, you've got all this extra, and you feed tractors and trailers are not the most environmentally friendly of kind of vehicles anyway. Also, you need extra land. So to grow the food to feed the chickens, those extra 1.5 billion chickens, like cereals and soybeans, you would need 7.6 million extra acres a year. So that's the size of the entire state of Maryland. So that's a lot more land you'd need to grow the extra feed and to house the extra birds. There's a lot more trucks on the roads. 19 billion additional litres of water for the chickens to drink, and that does not include the water you would need to water the plants to make the feed to feed the chickens. And also, while they're alive and they're eating, they're also pooing. So you would have a huge amount of extra poo to deal with, extra manure. So roughly 13 billion additional kilograms a year of manure. That's enough to put a pile on a football field that is roughly 27 times higher than the actual stadium that it's piled in. So that's a lot of poo. So yes, in theory, slower growing strains are great, but a bit like the organic and free range birds, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you've got this potential solution, but when you think about it carefully and more about the impacts that will have beyond the birds themselves, it's possibly not so feasible as you first thought. So where that really leaves us is with the genetics companies again. So like I said earlier, they are trying their absolute utmost to breed birds that are not susceptible to all these issues. So they select the most elite birds they can find in their breeding stock with the best health indicators, and then they look at the production parameters of them, because pretty much production parameters are pretty much at their peak. You'd be hard pushed to get a bird that grew faster than the ones that we have now. So they're sitting statically on a lot of the performance parameters, and what they're focusing on weeding out now is all the health and welfare issues. So they do look at growth rate and meat yield, but then equally they are looking at leg health and immune competence, resistance to pathogens, growth, temperament, because you don't want, you want birds that are relaxed and happy when they're being bred and in farms. You don't want birds that are really highly strung and anxious all the time, because that's also not fair. So what they are now selecting for superior leg strength, fully functional cardiovascular systems, because obviously with these bigger birds, that's a lot more bird to vascularize. So that, often your heart and lungs are under a lot more strain than they would have been in a smaller bird. And so, they're basically making sure that they do not allow birds with these welfare issues that aren't as well developed to carry that extra weight through into the breeding programs. So what they do is, when they would be selecting the next generation of breeding stock, none of the candidates for breeding would be quite old enough and have reached sexual maturity to really show if they're going to demonstrate any of these traits. So what they have is they have maps of the family trees and ancestors, and they record and gene sequence and sample every bird that goes through these systems, and they record all the kind of traits that they display. And they're still looking at figuring out, they're still doing huge amounts of genetic research to see which gene markers are linked to which traits, and to try and predict other traits that might be appearing that could be negative. They are really, really fastidious now about trying really hard to make sure that they're not breeding in any more issues, and trying really hard to breed out the issues that we see. It's like when you look at the dogs at Crufts, isn't it? You've got all those flat-faced dogs. And now breeders have started to realise, and they're trying really hard to breed out those traits while still keeping, the ones that they want that aren't negative. So they let their breeder stock reach market weight, thoroughly evaluate them for any issues that post-mortem them, have a real detailed look at what's going on, what's functioning properly, what could function better. And then they will take out whole lines. If they see like a problem arising in one particular line, they'll just whip the whole thing out. So, they are getting there, but obviously sod's law, it's a lot slower to breed things out than it is to accidentally breed them in. But they are trying their best. And this is kind of the best solution we have to this problem, is to support the birds that we have now as best we can through management practices and through nutrition and through kind of appropriate care and husbandry, while also trying to make sure that the birds we breed for the future are actually fit for purpose, so we can breed them and they can live happy, healthy lives while they're on the farm. So what will the chicken of the future look like? Will it be healthier? Definitely. Will it be bigger? Probably not. Will it be more efficient? I don't know. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to get a bird much more efficient than the one we've got now. Will we rely more on lab grown meat? Because that's hitting more and more things in the press now. So it might be that actually we get rid of intensive farming and the cheap meat is produced in a lab, and then people that want super fancy, extra high welfare, amazing chicken that's had butlers and things, they can go to the shop and buy that chicken. But the people that need that cheap protein source because they've got families to feed and things, might be that they have a lab grown alternative that's affordable to them instead. And then obviously we've got veganism and vegetarian is becoming much more widespread and much more popular. So people, if we see that trend continue, it's nowhere near going to take meat out of the picture. It would be a miracle if everyone turned vegan or vegetarian tomorrow, and that would be catastrophic for our economy. But it's likely that there will be less of a demand for the, the real cheap meat. Definitely, I would think. But yeah, I think that is everything. If anyone has any questions.
Super, thank you. Sophie, we've just got one popped in saying, do you see the potential of using insect protein in broiler feed, as a replacement of soya?
Yeah, so I think if they can get insect protein through, that'd be brilliant, because you can interestingly also extract medium chain fatty acids from black soldier fly larvae as well. So if you can get that in, obviously that's a very good source of protein for the birds. But the problems you have with that at the moment, I know the main blockers for insect protein currently are the fact that it's not a systematic regulated kind of industry, you know, because it hasn't been approved for use, so it hasn't had widespread uptake. So what you get for your protein source is hugely variable. So it's not currently very appealing for mainstream use, because what people that are formulating diets for their animals want is predictability. So they want to order a ton of wheat and know what its protein content is roughly going to be based on where it's from and what time of year it was grown. What they currently get with protein extracted from insects is a massive variability in what's in there, because there's so many different ways of farming the insects and processing the insects and things from there onwards. So at the moment, it's really difficult to use as a raw material because it's so variable. And for it to get that mainstream uptake and acceptance, you kind of need the extra, you need the pull through from consumers to really kickstart that. And it's a really difficult kind of catch-22, I think.
If anyone has any more questions, feel free to type them in. So there we go. What are some exciting research areas that students like us at Harper could look at getting into in the future?
So if you're looking at poultry and things, really what we've got coming up is an increasing trend towards complete removal of antibiotics. So obviously growth promoters have been banned for a long time, since 2006. But what we see now is people trying to be very preemptive and preventative. So a lot more people are putting in place things like acidifying feed and water to prevent any infection at all. And also people are trying to move away from ionophores. So if you want to find a cure for coccidiosis that doesn't involve ionophores or vaccinations, then that would be a multi-million-pound idea. But yeah, there's lots of interesting things, but a lot of it does, because they're reducing the amount of minerals also that they want people to use from an environmental perspective. So there's lots of new legislation that's come into play fairly recently, looking at reducing the maximum limits for things like copper and zinc in feed. So, you know, anything where you're looking at increased uptake of minerals, because they want them to excrete as little as possible, more efficiency with extracting kind of the minerals from the food sources, all that sort of thing, I would say.
Plenty to get your teeth into.
Yeah.
Keep questions coming if anyone has any. Just one thought which I thought of, which came to my mind quite early on when we were talking about market share and things. Areas such as like duck and geese, is there anything kind of up and coming there, or do you think, obviously it's never going to overtake chicken
No.
At all, but is that a growing area?
I don't think so. You don't really see a lot of it at all. I think it's a very niche market. Obviously with duck, you've got basically, I think it's one duck producer does the majority, 90% of the world's duck production, Cherry Valley ducks with their Pekings and things. And that's all, like, some of them, they sell a load into Asia, they sell a load into the UK. You know, they're just, there's not an awful lot of stuff. Or no, it's not. They've got they do the Pekings, and then there's another duck, Gressingham ducks tend to do a lot more of the ducks you see in supermarket and that sort of thing. But with geese and stuff, it's very, very niche. You know, not very many people will have goose for dinner anymore.
No, it's kind of, this time it would be the only sort of time of
year.
I've got a question. Is game nutrition as researched as chicken, and is it just as important?
Well, I particularly enjoy game. The whole game sector, I really like it, but sadly, no, it is nowhere near as researched as chicken. Partly because it's much more complicated. So there's far many more breeds of pheasant. So depending on where your pheasant is going to be shot will depend on the breed you use, because some are designed for you know, woodier terrain, some are designed for more open terrain. A lot of their nutritional requirements are very similar, but you'd want more protein in a game diet. But then a lot more of the game sector is based on tradition, I would say, than actual solid research, because people don't do a lot of research into game things. A lot of game farmers use poultry products that have been developed for use in broilers or layers, and they have very similar efficacy in game birds. But with game, it's things like you know, most game people will put aniseed in and they ride or die by their aniseed because that's their attractant to stop their birds wandering off to someone else's patch. But, you know, they wouldn't necessarily put as much stock in, you know, if you came to them and said, I've got this miracle additive that will do X, Y, and Z, you know, they wouldn't necessarily be as open to that kind of thing, because a lot of their methods, it's a very kind of family business, I think, more so than poultry farming, which tends to be a lot more kind of integrated with big producers now.
A lot more larger scale.
Yeah, definitely. Although we do breed a lot more game in the UK now, because it used to be a lot more of our stock came over from France, and now we've got some really big game breeders in the UK.
Yeah.
So it might go more that direction, you know. Hopefully.
Maybe
I'd like to work with more pheasants.
Look more into that sort of research potentially.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Does anybody have any other questions? Otherwise, we can wrap up there. I'd just like to say thank you very much, Sophie, for your time this evening. It's really, really interesting presentation. It has been recorded, so if any of you want to go back and watch it again, it'll be uploaded on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. You know, if anyone that you know missed this and you know has an interest in poultry, you know, feel free to send this out to them. But thank you so much, Sophie, for your time.
You're very welcome.
Been really interesting.
Yeah,
it's been really good to talk to you.
Yeah, feel free to be in touch. You have my email, so I'm quite happy to answer questions people have. And also, we do run a studentship at Trouw, where we have people come for their sandwich year. And we had our last student was a Harper student, and our current one is also a Harper student. So we like Harper students at Trouw. We have very good experiences with them.
If anyone would like to get in touch with Trouw, then feel free to give me an email, and I can pass on the details to you. I'm sure that would be fine. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sophie. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope you have a lovely Christmas.
Yeah, you too.
Lovely. Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye.